Liah Greenfeld, good, good day, good evening, good afternoon for you. I suppose you are in Boston now?
Yes, yes, I'm now in Boston. And Lucien, si
Yes.
tu peux parler français avec moi et je répondrai en anglais.
Ah, d'accord. Yeah.
Ah,
Ok.
c'est
Oui.
peut-être
Non, mais
euh,
ok. Ok.
mieux
Parce que
pour
tu,
vous, pour toi.
d'accord. Tu comprends mieux en français. Alors, dis-moi, Lia, moi je t'ai connu il y a maintenant, ça fait 6 ans hein, qu'on se connaît.
Oh, oui.
En 2014, quand j'étais venu à Boston là pour cette université là qui
Mhm.
réfléchissait sur ce qui se passait au Proche-Orient, en Israël et puis un peu partout. D'ailleurs, j'avais été très étonné sous certains aspects qui avait beaucoup de naïveté. Enfin, je me rappelle, enfin là je suis un peu long, mais ça me faisait penser que j'étais intervenu en séance plénière, en assemblée, là, lorsque le représentant palestinien disait toujours des choses un peu bizarres et j'ai trouvé ça étrange. Oh, excuse-moi, il y a la lumière qui s'en va. Alors attends, je vais suspendre. Oh mince! Alors, Lia, tu as écrit des ouvrages très importants et d'ailleurs, j'essaye de... Là, je vais commencer à en traduire un là, sur la manière dont la société agit sur la mentalité, sur la santé psychique et physique. En fait, les deux sont liés. Et puis en plus, aujourd'hui, avec tout ce qui se passe, je trouve que ton livre est très d'actualité. Mais tu as écrit aussi un autre livre sur le nationalisme, mais au sens large, pas au sens européen, péjoratif du nationalisme, au sens de considérer sa nation comme étant la supérieure à toutes les autres. Mais ton idée, c'était plutôt le fait d'avoir une, un certain, une certaine osmose entre différents groupes, un certain sentiment d'appartenance, comme, comme les Platon pouvait le penser dans sa République, ou Bodin, mais aussi Ernest Renan. Hein,
Oui.
c'est l'esprit, le sentiment de partager un même destin, etc. Alors, suite à ces deux livres que je trouve très importants et surtout de plus en plus d'actualité, alors que je les ai écrits depuis un certain nombre d'années, et depuis qu'on s'est vu il y a 6 ans, dis-moi, en essayant, bon, on va peut-être partager les deux, mais on peut les articuler aussi, dis-moi, qu'est-ce qui t'a frappé, qu'est-ce qui a changé depuis qu'on s'est vu, là, depuis 6 ans, en bien, en mal, sur ces deux aspects-là? La nation, les gens par rapport à la nation, l'idée de nation, et puis en fait, est-ce que la société aujourd'hui va bien? Est-ce que les individus vont bien ou mal? Qu'est-ce qui se passe? Quel est ton diagnostic, docteur Liah Greenfeld? Your diagnostic, please.
Well, thank you for those interesting questions and the interesting way of connecting those books. Now, those two books represent the first and the third volumes of a trilogy that I wrote on nationalism. And from the very beginning, uh, it was a developing reality, and it constantly remained very very timely. Not for a moment, I wrote the book on nationalism, the first one, Nationalism, Five Roads to Modernity. I published it in 1992. And not for a moment since then, the reality of nationalism became unimportant in our lives. And it seems that we discover it again and again and again, every time with a great surprise, but it never disappeared. So since 2014, when we met, it is just a continuation of the same situation all the time, every year. The world of, let's say, bien-pensant discovers nationalism again, and thinks that nationalism will bring our reality to some sort of terrible end, and continuously, year after year after year, those people on the left are in fact mistaken. They don't understand what they're talking about. And spread a lot of, through their own ignorance, spread a lot of misinformation that only feeds.
Tu peux donner des exemples? Do you give some examples?
Yes.
Also, do you make the difference? Est-ce que tu fais la différence entre libéral classique and extreme left and tiers-mondiste or postmodern? Because do you know, I suppose you know Rubin, some people in YouTube in network said inside the left you have two tendencies, tu as deux tendances, mais l'une est plus forte maintenant. Tu as extreme left qui est more dominante, more powerful, and you are the traditional liberal classic, but they try to reinforce their position, but it's very difficult. What do you mean when you explain for you? Qu'est-ce que tu dis quand tu parles de la gauche aux États-Unis, par exemple?
Well, of course, it is very difficult to define because in Europe, it is different than in the United States. In the United States and in Europe, there are very many varieties depending on the country. So what in maybe considered the left in France is not really what is the left in the United States. In the United States, only in some way they overlap, but not entirely. And in the United States, I'm speaking from the American point of view. And in the United States, classical liberalism, by which here in the English-speaking world, we mean liberalism of the John Stuart Mill type.
Yes.
You know, individualistic liberalism, classical individualism.
Like libertarian,
to a certain extent, yes. So this is considered the right in the United States. This is no longer the left. It has not been the left in the United States for a very, very long time.
Mhm.
So this position, the libertarian position, or classical liberal position of John Stuart Mill type, you know, it is not considered the position of the left here, not at all. In fact, they may be even considered extreme right. Certainly, they would be considered conservative, you know, conservative and not progressive.
But now it's not similarly between Europe and US. For instance, the cancel culture, the woke culture is the same now in France, UK, Germany, US. You have uniformization of the left now. And before, of course, you have a difference. For instance, the Democrat Party is like center-right in France, a party center-right, a mix of free market and social assistance, if you want, briefly. But now the domination of the uniformization in the superstructure, you have in the same Occidental country, except maybe the Japanese, Korean, no, you have the extreme left, which dominated with racialism, with
Yes, yes, certainly.
all the debate now, and you have no difference. Maybe in France it's not too too far, but we have the same situation. On a la même situation dans les universités. Dans les
Oui, oui, oui.
universités, il est très difficile de parler maintenant, même des gens qui sont pourtant respectés à gauche ont du mal à parler dans les universités.
Oui.
Il n'y a pas que chez vous.
Yes,
Il n'y a pas que chez vous.
yes. It's the same here, and indeed on this racialist and the collectivist side, all the lefts become very uniform across different countries. So the left now is basically a position. Uh, a, it's very interesting. It is a position inclining, I would say, towards totalitarianism, that we knew in the Soviet Union, most of all, and in fascist Italy and in National Socialist Germany. So all those ideas, the Soviet ideas, the German ideas, and the Italian fascist ideas, those were all varieties of socialism. And at first, they took on a Marxist coloration. But the main point was the rejection of the individual, as an autonomous actor, and submerging of this individual under the influence of a group. So the individual, for all those movements of thought, was not an autonomous actor, And in fact, there was a terrible fear of liberty, of the freedom of the individual. Now, in this respect, all of those movements were the reactions. All of those movements were reactionary, and they were reactions to the extraordinary revolution in our existential experience and thought that nationalism as such has wrought. Nationalism emerged first in England as a result of some historical circumstances. And it was a completely new perspective on society, on a completely new imaginary of what the world, and specifically the social world, was. And instead of the idea of a God created reality based on the principle of inequality, that is a society of orders, hierarchically organized orders of bellatores, oratores, and laboratores. It suddenly, nationalism brought in a perspective that considered the social world as consisting of sovereign communities of fundamentally equal members with an inclusive identity. So if before, for example, you would offend a French nobleman, a member of the French nobility, by saying, oh, you are a member of the French people, that would be very offensive. Now, everyone was a member of the people. The people was defined as a nation. The identity was inclusive, and the nation at the time, the word nation, why it was used, it at the time meant an elite, a cultural and political elite of the highest order. So when in English in the 16th century, the words people, which at that time meant plebs, was equated, became the synonym of the word nation, which at the time meant cultural and political elite of the highest order, this equation created a completely new imagination of the community. The entire community then partook of the elite's sovereignty, of the elite's ability to decide on the matters of the highest importance regarding the direction of the development of the community, and the entire community became a community of equals. So this, of course, were the principles of fundamental equality within a society and the principle of popular sovereignty, because the community as a whole was sovereign, and those are the principles of democracy. So nationalism brought into the modern world democracy. Now, in England, because of the historical formation of this view, this all happened because of the extraordinary upward and only upward mobility of the people from the people, gens du peuple, right? In English, you cannot say, because they're both for Jean and for peuple, you only have the same word, people, right? So
Oui, oui, the
persons
people.
who rose from the people.
Yeah.
So, and this, the extraordinary 100-year-long upward mobility of masses of the people. And this happened because, as a result of the War of the Roses, the entire feudal nobility of England, the entire feudal aristocracy, was physically destroyed, including the royal family itself. So a completely new dynasty, a very, very distant relative of the Plantagenets, Henry Tudor, came to the throne, and he himself was half commoner. He wasn't really an aristocrat. And there was a need for a new aristocracy since the old aristocracy didn't exist. So numbers, are great numbers of very intelligent and educated people who were commoners, they rose up. And they needed, at that time, the feudal consciousness, the ideas that were dominant were those of the society of orders and of divine providence. And one was supposed to stay in the place in which one was born. One couldn't be mobile. And there was, even as it's so well known in France, there was even a belief that the nobility had a different chemical constitution, biological constitution. They had blue blood, while
Yes.
the commoners had red blood. In France, there was another thing on top of it. The royal lineage itself had translucent blood, yet another difference, chemical difference. Those ideas were firmly believed in. And so those commoners in England who rose, they were upwardly mobile, which was impossible given in the consciousness of the period. They knew that they had red blood, and yet they were now occupying positions that only blue-blooded people could have. So they needed to rationalize that in order to make it both legitimate and positive. The experience was very positive, but they couldn't understand it. And they needed to understand it, and understand it in a good way. And so somebody had this idea of a genius to equate the people of England, which meant basically the common people, right? The lower classes. But the entire people of England is a nation. And nation, the word nation, was at that time used only in the church councils. So those were tiny groups of people that represented the parties of the ecclesiastical councils of the Respublica Christiana. And they were debating basically the scope of the power of the Pope. They represented various potentates, various princes, terrestrial princes and princes of the church. In any case, they were extremely powerful individuals. And this Englishman equated the two concepts, creating this completely new revolutionary idea. But because in England, it was really the situation of those individuals, the nationalism that emerged in England, this perspective, this new consciousness, was individualistic. The first original nationalism that emerged was best expressed, in fact, in the classical liberalism. The ideology, the consciousness of classical liberalism was the best expression of the original English nationalism.
It's politeia, yeah.
But you see, the situation was never, the English situation, English historical situation, was never repeated. And so when other nations followed, other societies rather, followed suit and imported nationalism, they did not have this possibility to explain and interpret their individual experience in this light. So the first two countries that actually followed the suit of England in becoming nations, in defining themselves as nations and acquiring nationalism, were simultaneously France and Russia. In Russia, this was because of a very determined, great autocrat, Peter the Great. He just wanted to make his country a nation because he traveled a lot in Europe, especially in England, and he understood that this national consciousness made the people extremely committed to the development and greatness of their society. So he just imposed nationalism on his upper stratum. In France, this was, and it happened in both of those societies in the 18th century, so 2 centuries after England. So in France, this was because throughout the 17th century, the French aristocracy suffered greatly at the hands of the absolutist kings, in particular Louis XIV. So, and yet they were looking at England and seeing that in England, they forgot, of course, what happened a century ago, but they looked at England and saw that in England, aristocracy fared marvelously. So somehow in their minds, for obvious reason, those two things, the well-being of the aristocracy and nationalism, became combined. And then, after the death of Louis XIV, they also discovered that England, that for centuries was basically looked down upon from France, and it was in every respect a backwater. England, with its national consciousness, suddenly became tremendously competitive and skyrocketed in its prestige in Europe, in its military power, in its naval power. It wasn't at all powerful in this respect before. And in its economic power and in its cultural power, it basically replaced France already by the beginning of at the beginning of the 18th century. England replaced France as the central power in Europe. And of course, at that time, Europeans thought about Europe as the world. So England replaced France as the most admired and most powerful country in Europe.
And why sorry to interrupt you, but why England become superior than France? Because about absolutism, it's 14 Louis XIV is very absolutist king. It's
No,
about the
no,
people.
it wasn't because of what happened in France. It was because of what happened in England. And this is the subject of the second book of the trilogy that you are not familiar with, which is called The Spirit of Capitalism,
Oh, yeah.
Nationalism and Economic Growth.
Mhm.
What happened in England is that, you see, national consciousness in distinction to other types of consciousness. So nationalism is, it makes individual by defining the nation and the people as a sovereign community of fundamentally equal members with an inclusive identity. It makes the personal identity of every member of the nation a dignified identity. And in this, it differs from all other identities. You see, Christianity divides the people into orders. So some of them are the upper clergy, the nobility. They have dignified identities.
Yes,
The
but
power,
in England you have also the Lords and the Common
yes,
Chamber.
but it didn't matter because they were all fundamentally equal. And
Mhm.
especially in the 16th century, as it developed, all the lords, they came from the common people. The most important families, even today, they remember their origins. So, and the mobility became so built in to that. So everything depended on the individual. You see, it didn't matter where you were born. So, and where does this dignity of the individual identity in nationalism come from? It comes from the membership in the nation. The fact that one is English, this is what is responsible for the freedom of the individual to occupy any position in society, even the most important. And because of this dependence of their personal dignity on the nation, nationalism is an extremely competitive spirit because members of the nation are dedicated to the glory of the nation.
Union Jack, Union Jack.
Yes, but it's not only, it's the same then in France and in Russia and whatever.
Mhm,
You see, the moment nationalism arrives,
mhm.
the community becomes extremely competitive. Now, for the first 2 centuries, for the first 2 centuries, England alone was a nation. The other societies were not. So in those 2 centuries, England became extremely competitive in every respect, but it did not have competitors. You see, it believed that all the other societies, because of its own worldview, England believed that all the other societies were nations and also competitive, but they were not. So England was all the time lived in fear that somebody would outcompete it, would be better than it. And so its development was just so powered. You understand? So first of all, it created capitalism, capitalist economy, that is economy oriented to growth. Before that, before the 16th century, all the economies were oriented to survival, subsistence. Those were subsistence-oriented economies. And subsistence-oriented economies, the logic of those economies was Malthusian logic, the logic of Malthusian Caesars. You understand? So an economy would become stronger, it would grow, then the population would grow, the population would eat all the surplus, the economy would decline, right? The population would decline, and then the cycles would continue. So those were, now for England, because it needed to compete, it could never stop. You see, it could not eat the surplus. It created the economy oriented to constant growth. And before other countries.
And you have the, no, sorry. And you have the trade unions. You have trade unions in the middle of the 19th century. And by the way, Marx was very interested to see the trade unions bonds in the same times that the capitalism grows also. But I don't know why. No, I suppose because the spirit of the light philosophy is possible to reform profoundly the society to in the spirit like you analyze the link.
Parler français si tu veux.
Le lien que tu fais entre nationalisme et démocratie, je trouve ça très intéressant quand tu dis plus une société est une nation, un peu comme Sparte d'un certain côté, mais enfin, plus elle est démocratique, même si chez Sparte c'était entre égaux d'un autre côté, mais il y avait les archontes, enfin il y avait quand même une supériorité spirituelle. Mais les Sparte n'avaient pas l'esprit grec non plus, puisque ils se sont opposés à Athènes et ils ont demandé aux Perses de s'allier, alors que bon, c'est pas tout à fait la même chose. Mais il y a cette idée d'osmose entre l'individualisme donc, dont tu parles, l'esprit de la communauté et puis la compétition avec soi-même et avec les autres, etc. Et là, tu penses que c'est ça qui a donné l'esprit anglais, en fait.
Oui.
Mais l'esprit français, lui, était emprisonné dans les ordres, dans la division, ce que tu as dit tout à l'heure, je résume un petit peu là avec le sang bleu, l'hérédité qui était donnée d'avance, alors que ça rompait avec la tradition que Platon a bien définie dans la République ou dans le politique, c'est-à-dire c'est les meilleurs, Aristos, Kratos, c'est les meilleurs, comme tu as dit tout à l'heure, les lords en Angleterre, ils pouvaient venir de familles les plus humbles. Et c'est pas ce qui s'est passé en France. Donc il y a eu une sclérose. Il y a eu une maladie de croissance en France qui a fait que, à cause de Versailles, il y a certains qui disaient ça, à cause de Versailles, à cause de la centralisation à Versailles, ça affaiblit la France, ça affaiblit entre Louis XIV et Louis XV, l'aristocratie française sont devenus des enfants. Sont devenus des enfants qui jouaient à Colin-Maillard pendant que l'Angleterre, elle construisait l'univers. Voilà, j'arrête là. Mais
Yeah,
Marx
this
était
was,
très
you see,
intéressé par ça. Marx était très intéressé par ça.
this was, the thing was actually that France, in France, the aristocracy, yes, they were, if one reads Tocqueville, one sees very, very well, oh, um, better even, if one reads the actual diaries, something like Saint-Simon, right, of the period, one sees that those aristocrats, they were suffering. They were suffering like caged animals, even though their cages were maybe gilded, but they were like caged animals. And they were growing poorer and poorer because they had to spend their money at Versailles and all that. So theirs was, but they were what? Maybe 2% of the French population. At the same time, there was a growing bourgeoisie, which was pretty well off. The thing was that their spirit in the 17th and 18th century, when England was already light years ahead in development, in every development, in economic development, in cultural development. After all, science, modern science was created in England at this period. And why did England choose science to compete in? Because it could not compete in with France and Italy in ancient knowledge. You remember there was this huge debate between the ancients and the moderns.
Yes.
And all those societies with Romance languages, they were direct inheritors of the ancient knowledge of Latin. And England wasn't, even though, of course, by the end of the 16th century, its first century of nationalism, it already had Shakespeare, and again was light years ahead of everyone else, because everyone admired them so much for that. But the great thing was that it was the first scientific power. And in this, the French really followed them. So it wasn't that France was going down. It wasn't going down. It was just as it always has been. It's that England was going forward and upward so much. So this created this extra. And before that, England was nothing. It was a little country, rather poor, a tiny island country. After all, now we're talking always about Britain. But at that time, it was just England, the southern part of a little island. It was nothing in comparison to France.
And
But with
Spain.
its,
And
but
Spain.
with it,
And Spain. And Spain
and
also.
Spain, of course.
Yes.
And now, because of its nationalism, it took up France and Spain. After all, it defeated the Armada.
Yes.
They sent the Armada there, and they had a shameful defeat. So it emerged as the greatest military power, all because of nationalism. Greatest scientific, that is cultural power, with the greatest literature that did not exist before. They had no tradition. And greatest economic power.
Just, by the way, just I interrupt you just because il ne faut pas oublier aussi la Germanie, l'Allemagne. Et ça me fait penser que il y a Nietzsche. Nietzsche disait que Pour Schelling n'aimait pas du tout Locke. Il détestait Locke. Parce que quand tu parlais de Shakespeare tout à l'heure, ça me faisait penser à Goethe aussi, d'un
Mhm.
certain côté. Et il y avait quand même cette idée que la science aussi, articulée à la littérature, elle était forte aussi en Allemagne. Mais l'Allemagne, elle regardait plutôt la France que l'Angleterre, puisque Hegel, il admirait plutôt Napoléon que Cromwell, j'imagine, et il était émerveillé par la puissance de l'État en France et moins par l'esprit de liberté qui pouvait exister au- en Angleterre. Et je finirai là, je dirais que c'est grâce à cet esprit de liberté qu'il y a eu Churchill. C'est Churchill qui a pu vaincre Hitler. Et bon, il y a eu évidemment les États-Unis qui étaient là. Mais en 40, il n'y avait que Churchill. C'est tout. Et Churchill, je pense que c'est vraiment ce que tu dis là. C'est la fusion entre l'idée nationale, la démocratie, la liberté de l'individu, la science, la raison, contre l'esprit totalitaire, absolutiste, dégénéré que Hitler représentait comme un sous Napoléon, un sous wagnérien, si tu veux. Enfin bon,
Oui.
mais j'ai l'impression que, enfin, pourquoi, à ton avis, Schelling, justement, il pouvait haïr les Anglais? Est-ce que c'était, comme Marx disait, c'est l'esprit bourgeois, l'esprit petit bourgeois, le fait que les Anglais avaient perdu la chevalerie, le côté grandiose, le côté que les Américains ont gardé. Les Américains ont, peut-être avec la conquête de l'Ouest, avec les sectes protestantes qui allaient dans l'Ouest, il y a une sorte de reconquête, le peuple élu, les Américains, quand ils arrivent aux États-Unis, enfin, quand ils arrivent en Amérique, ils se considèrent comme un nouveau peuple aussi. Enfin, enfin, essaye de finir là sur cette question-là, et on va essayer d'aborder le deuxième aspect qui est qu'est-ce qui fait que tout cet esprit que tu as décrit là, riche, euh, fort, comment ça se fait qu'il est malade maintenant? Est-ce que
Hmm.
c'est à cause de l'urbanité, la ville, la télévision, la fin de quelque chose, la communauté, ben justement, l'esprit de démocratie, enfin voilà, qu'est-ce qui a fait? Là, tu as parlé de la puissance de l'esprit national, qui n'est pas du tout ce qu'on dit en France ou ailleurs, c'est-à-dire un esprit étriqué, un esprit hitlérien presque, hein, c'est la supériorité qu'on voit parfois dans certains groupes, effectivement, que ce soit en Serbie, avec les loups, en Turquie ou en France aussi, avec l'action française et puis autres groupes, les Maurassiens qui essayaient de retrouver ça. Et aux États-Unis, les admirateurs de Hitler aussi, le Ku Klux Klan, etc. Mais c'est une minorité, ça, c'est une minorité. Et le plus grand était tourné autour de ce que tu as dit, là, cette fusion, cette force là, qui permettait le American Way of Life. D'ailleurs, c'est pour ça que beaucoup d'immigrés veulent venir aux États-Unis, c'est pour vivre encore ce American Dream. Mais qu'est-ce qui se passe maintenant? C'est ça qu'il faut que tu fasses la transition. Finis sur ce que tu expliques là, le
Okay, so first I'll
Germanie,
address the
entre
first I'll yeah.
Allemagne, Angleterre, France, et après la naissance des États-Unis, puis après la Seconde Guerre mondiale, les 60, l'année 60, les années 60. Et qu'est-ce qui se passe maintenant? Alors bon, c'est un peu synthétisé beaucoup, hein?
Well, I'll first address the question of Schelling and Locke,
Yeah.
and why Schelling didn't at all like English philosophers. Well, it's also very important to keep in mind that we are talking about centuries, right? So it starts in England in the 16th century, the very beginning of the 16th century. It starts in France and Russia in the 18th century. Basically, in France, nationalism emerges truly and self-affirms during the French Revolution. So very end of the 18th century. Nationalism starts in Germany in the 19th century. Nationalism in Germany is very late. So, but whenever there is nationalism, there is immediate comparison between one's nation and other nations. There is a constant competition for prestige because of this dignifying of the personal identity through nationalism everywhere, and therefore great investment in the dignity of one's nation. So from this point of view of dignity, one's nation is constantly compared to other nations. And if a nation has nothing to be proud of in terms of its achievement, then there is a tremendous envy, a collective envy, and ressentiment against this other nation.
As Nietzsche said.
Yes, of course, the concept is Nietzsche's. And a sense of inferiority. And this sense of inferiority makes people hate. It generates hatred of those one envies. So in France, the interesting thing, ressentiment was very brief. There was in the 18th century was the century of Anglophilia. In France, they adored everything English.
Like Montesquieu.
Yes, like Montesquieu, like Voltaire, like, everything, English clothes, redingot, this was riding coat, right? They translated everything and they dressed like the English. They had English gardens, they imitated everything. Goodness gracious, they even imitated an hospital for the insane.
And do you know the conflict, the link, la dispute entre Rousseau et Hume? Tu sais que Rousseau était venu se réfugier chez Hume et qu'à un moment donné, Rousseau, il a cru que Hume voulait le persécuter, voulait l'emprisonner.
Oh.
Tu es au courant de ça? Tu étais au courant que...
Non.
Ah oui, il y a eu un livre comme ça qui est sorti. Hume explique quand Rousseau avait beaucoup de difficultés lorsqu'il a sorti Émile, son livre sur l'éducation, il était persécuté en France et il a en Suisse, France, et Hume lui a dit, ben viens en Angleterre. Et Rousseau était très surpris de l'hospitalité de Hume et il ne comprenait pas pourquoi Hume s'intéressait à lui. Et et comme Rousseau, il travaillait, il était un peu malade aussi, Rousseau, hein, un peu.
Oh.
Ouais, comme, je ne sais pas si c'est comme Oderlin ou alors comme, enfin bref, il y avait une persécution. Il se sentait persécuté et il a cru que justement, là, ça pourrait t'intéresser, justement, tout ton travail sur le mental, le rapport avec la société. Il a cru que Hume, la gentillesse de Hume, son hospitalité, c'était intéressé. C'était intéressé. Et donc, il a raconté que Hume l'embêtait, l'emprisonnait, l'empêchait de. Enfin, il y a eu une cabale. Il y a eu et Hume a été beaucoup blessé par ça. Mais peut-être que c'est quelque chose de déformé. Pourquoi je pense à ça, c'est que quand tu disais que il y avait une sorte d'anglophilie, tout le monde pensait, un peu comme au XVIIe siècle, c'était la France, au XVIIIe, c'est plutôt l'Angleterre. Eh bien, il y avait justement Rousseau, il a vécu ça aussi, d'une certaine manière, mais il ne supportait pas que cette anglophilie, quoi. Il supportait pas que ce soit plus la France, mais plutôt l'Angleterre, quoi. D'ailleurs, c'est pour ça d'ailleurs, il détestait, il préférait Locke, lui, alors que Schelling déteste Locke. Rousseau préfère Locke à Hobbes. Il n'aime pas Hobbes. Voilà, non, c'était juste continue sur l'anglophilie du 18e.
So what was happening was that they loved the English, and Voltaire would say they very specifically imitated the English because they admired them so much. You know, for example, nationalism in France starts with somebody saying, "Il faut nous une nation." We need a nation, like the English. It was so explicit.
Et qui a dit ça en France? C'est Voltaire qui dit ça?
No, just a second. I am finding you the quotation. Too many books that I wrote, you know, so that I cannot find it. Philippe published. He published a book in 1789 called Philippe Grovel. And he published a book in 1789 called De l'autorité de Montesquieu dans la Révolution présente. And it is there that he said, this, just a second, and it is there that he said, what I just told you. We must have a nation. In order to make the revolution, we must have a nation for such a grand undertaking. Il faut nous, une nation pour tel grand ouvrage, quelque chose. Et la nation est un être. So it was really very, very explicit. We need a nation like the English, and the nation will be born. It was so very clearly indicated. And Voltaire said a little before that, that we, the students of the English, we soon will become the teachers of our masters. So you see, there was no envy. Why? Because he believed completely that very soon the French would emerge as more prestigious, more powerful. And in fact, the revolution, to a very great extent, the reason for the revolution was to overcome the English, to become the nation of liberty, more than, more than England, to become better than England. This is what happened in France, because France actually had incredible achievements, especially cultural achievements, in comparison to all of Europe. They had a very well-developed language, better developed than anything else. Modern English only begins to emerge in the 16th century. And that was already a period of glory for French literature, the 16th century. So every cultured individual, including in England, spoke French.
Yes.
Henry VIII spoke French. He wrote to his lady love, Anne Boleyn, his love letters in French. Not because English didn't exist. It was just emerging in this period. That's why the English emphasized science that didn't exist anywhere else. So it was easier for them to compete in science than to compete in linguistic arts, because France and Italy were so much ahead of them. There were extraordinary tradition of laws, of learning. Paris was considered the modern Athens. So for this reason, there was no really good reason for the French to envy the English. So the period of ressentiment in France was very short-lived. But Germany had absolutely no achievements. When nationalism began to develop in the very beginning of the 19th century, it only began to develop with the French invasion, with the Revolutionary Wars. They had absolutely no achievement. Romanticism just was emerging. What they had was the period of Sturm und Drang with Goethe, just before that, but nothing else. Nothing. No science. No literature. No literature. Absolutely none. No painting.
Jacobi fait machin. You have Jacobi and Schiller.
Yeah.
Schiller.
Just the very end. Yes. And he died in 95.
You have Leibniz. You have Leibniz. Leibniz.
Yeah, Leibniz, the only one.
Yes.
Yes. So there was this German Aufklärung.
Yes.
They were specifically, they were especially Leibniz, they were
And
so
Lessing maybe.
blessing. Yes, they were specifically competing against the French
And Kant,
because they
Emmanuel,
felt so they felt so inferior to them, to the French. So what happened with when we reach the Romantics with the young Romantics with Schlegel,
yes. And Kant,
they
you have Kant.
yes, who was not very much considered. Again, think it is the end of the 18th century.
Yes.
So, and this is the end of the 18th century, and this is the very beginning of German culture.
Mm-hmm.
So you have, in England, you have, of course, this extraordinary efflorescence. And in France, you have many centuries of superiority, of cultural superiority. So the main feeling among the Germans, among the German intellectuals, is ressentiment. And it is specifically, and you can see this in Marx very well too. It
Yes.
goes through Marx.
Fichte,
But
Fichte also.
Fichte, of course, Fichte very much.
Yeah.
But the early romantics, such as Schlegel, this whole coterie, they are very envious. They're very envious. And they try to constantly downgrade, humiliate both the English and the French culture. Because all the national conflicts, all the national relations, and all the national sentiments, international sentiments, are based on comparative dignity. So because Schlegel himself feels humiliated by the very existence of the French and English cultures, he is very critical of them. I mean, it's not only Locke that he didn't like. You know that in the Athenaeum, in the Athenaeum fragments, he wrote that, well, it was written by both him and his brother, right? You're talking about the Friedrich Schlegel, or August.
No, I did not know very well Schlegel. As I say, Schlechtmacher,
Yeah,
Schlechtmacher.
well, it's the same coterie, the same coterie. In any case, they have this fantastic book of Athenaeum fragments, and there they call, German culture is natural. French don't have any culture, they have only civilization. And this civilization is artificial, So the whole romantic attitude to France and England is the attitude of pure ressentiment and pure sense of inferiority.
But
And
in Nietzsche has the same or not the same
no,
ressentiment?
Nietzsche is not the same. Nietzsche is not the same, but Nietzsche is basically a century later. It's
Yes.
not the end of the 18th century, the beginning of the 19th, it's the very end of the 19th century.
But by the way, Nietzsche, I heard recently, I, I worked about this. Nietzsche essaye un peu comme tu fais maintenant, de trouver des bases objectives à la morale, comment la volonté de l'individu peut arriver à se surpasser. Et ce n'est pas seulement par des conventions, mais par quelque chose de plus solide. C'est pour ça qu'il était intéressé par la psychologie à la fin de sa vie. Et après, tu as le lien avec Lou Salomé, Freud,
Oui,
etc.
oui, oui, oui.
Et Nietzsche, par-delà le bien et le mal ou généalogie de la morale, en fait, il cherchait à sonder, à tester le contenu des valeurs. Est-ce que ces valeurs, ça sert à quelque chose pour que la volonté puisse se construire, puisse s'appuyer, disons. Et c'est là-dessus qu'il essayait à ce moment-là, de se dire que cette volonté, à quoi elle doit servir. Et pour lui, il voyait que la puissance, la volonté de puissance. Et donc, il n'était pas peut-être intéressé, comme chez lui, d'un certain côté, par le commerce. Le commerce, comme les Français aussi.
Mhm.
C'est, alors que les Anglais étaient considérés comme trop commerçants et pas assez grecs, en fait. La contemplation, enfin, ce que Hannah Arendt a expliqué déjà, la vie contemplativa, enfin la vie contemplative, quoi, et pas du tout la vie active, alors que la vie active, c'est ça qui donne la démocratie, c'est ça qui donne Athènes, en fait, d'un certain côté. Enfin bon, on s'éloigne, mais il y a cette idée que Nietzsche, quand même, c'est pas la même chose, mais il a du ressentiment un petit peu vis-à-vis enfin comme tu disais tout à l'heure, que l'esprit allemand n'est pas encore assez fort, en fait, par rapport à l'Angleterre, au Royaume Uni, qui domine le monde à la fin du 19e, quoi,
Yes. The German century was basically the 19th century. This is when they made whatever contributions, they were making. And before that, they had, there was no cultural achievements. They felt extremely inferior, both to England and to France. And they hated them for that. For that very reason, there was deep hatred. You can see this in all the sources, and I write a lot about that. In the German chapter. Now, this actually leads us very directly to the mental illnesses. You see, nationalism creates this competition, this constant competition that comes from the ideal of equality. The ideal of equality is brought into the world by nationalism. There was no ideal of equality before that. In fact, the encyclopedists, the encyclopedie, they wrote about the glorious harmony of hierarchy. So, this is the encyclopedia, Diderot's, nobody less than that. So equality was not at all an ideal, but nationalism makes equality the greatest value of our society, of society. And first, this equality is accepted. You see, that's why it is so easy to imitate nationalism. Because one doesn't, when people import nationalism into the countries which are not yet nationalistic, which are not yet nations, they do not see the risks because they think, okay, we are equal to all the others. And so now we're going to, enjoy all the same good things as those who are already developed nations are enjoying. But then what happens is that there is constant comparison of the dignity of your nation to the dignity of some other nations. And so those intellectuals, because it is mainly intellectuals, they start developing a terrible complex of inferiority. And complex of inferiority leads to depression. It leads to self-loathing, the problem with the self. And of course, self-loathing is a central, actually the central symptom of depression. A problem with identity, the identity that one doesn't like. And so this happens on the level of the nations and affects first the intellectuals who are actually importing the ideas of the nation into their societies. But then what happens in individualistic nations such as Britain or the United States? This competition constantly affects personal relations. You see, they're individualists. They're not collectivists. They are very involved in the dignity of their nation, but their personal identity, also based on this idea of equality of every member of the nation, they can be whoever they want, and yet they constantly fail because everyone wants to be the president of the United States, but only one is elected every 4 years, right? Everyone wants to be the greatest brain surgeon or the greatest Bill Gates milliardaire, but there is no equality of result. So they're constantly measuring themselves against all the others. And now, of course, with such things as Facebook, this measurement is in real time, going 24 hours a day. And they constantly see, more and more people see that they do not measure up. So they feel inferior. They feel very envious. They feel resentful. And in those individualistic nations, they feel resentful of their society, first of all. What is the other? I mean, those functional mental diseases, diseases such as depression, bipolar disorder, and schizophrenia, they are all diseases that are focused on the problems with the self and social adjustment. Because when one has a problem with oneself, one cannot be socially adjusted. So what you have in those individualistic societies, you have constant maladjustment and constant resentment against one's own society. And what do, well, this is all very interesting, but you know, would you like to stop it?
Yeah, okay. Quand tu parles d'une société qui redevient individualiste et qui à ce moment-là devient schizophrène, dépressive, est-ce que c'est uniquement lié à la société industrielle ou est-ce qu'on n'a pas vu ça aussi à Rome, lorsque Rome devient justement, n'est plus une république mais devient un empire, la décadence romaine, ou même la décadence de l'Empire romain germanique aussi, c'est-à-dire qu'à un moment donné, lorsque une nation centralise tout dans un seul endroit, eh bien, il y a une sorte de disparition, il y a une sorte de délitement. Et que c'est pas lié seulement à la société industrielle. Et si tu veux, on va arrêter là pour cette première partie. Tu réfléchis.
D'accord, d'accord.
On reprend. Ben, je te remercie, Liah. Et puis,
je te remercie. C'était très intéressant pour moi.
Ben, pour moi
Oui,
aussi, hein, pour, j'espère ceux qui, et celles qui nous écoutent, qui vont nous écouter. Et puis on reprend une deuxième partie quand ce sera possible. Bon.
d'accord.